As a Satanist, I don't wish to be included in your inclusivity, also casting a suspicious eye on those who would try to exclude parts of Satanism. I'll be answering questions from you, the listeners, here on Satansplain, plus a rundown on the basics of the Satanic calendar.
Well, it's not Satan worship, it's Satanism. It's embracing the life-enriching things which have traditionally been given the devil's name. Pride, lust, earthly success, rational self-interest, atheism, humor, nonconformity, science, a passion for living, being selective about whom we love. We don't see these as shameful sins, but empowering ideals. And we also recognize the psychological power and fun of symbolism and aesthetics, so we utilize Satan as mythology's most fitting mascot for what we're about.
Satansplain, Satanic Talk with Church of Satan Magister Bill M.
Magister Bill M. here with Satansplain. Most recently on Satansplain, I presented a 2-episode spanning look at the topic of logic and fallacies, a topic which, on the one hand, some may consider stereotypical atheism 101 stuff, but on the other hand, something I felt is still important for Satanists to know, something which carries some misconceptions with it, and I give numerous examples also of classical logical fallacies and how some people attempt to use them against Satanism. So if you have not listened to Satansplain episodes 30 and 31, that's what they're about, consider taking a listen sometime. As for this episode you're listening to right now, I'm mostly going to be reading and responding to some listener email, but before I dive into all of that, I would just like to comment on the change in the year, the change in the calendar year. As most of you already know, January 1st marked the change to the year 58 Anno Satanas. For those of you who may be new to Satanism and don't know what this refers to, this is the year according to the Satanic calendar, and here's what all of that means. For practical purposes, just about all humans cite the year according to the Christian calendar, or the Gregorian calendar as it's known as, since it was introduced by Pope Gregory XIII many centuries ago. Right now, as I record this, it is considered the year 2023 because supposedly Jesus of Nazareth was born in the year AD 1, Anno Domini 1. No, it's not 1 AD, it's AD 1. And no, AD does not stand for after death, it stands for Anno Domini, Latin for the year of our Lord. Christianity, you see, was the predominant religion of the Europeans, the ones who came up with a lot of the technology and, world conquering over the centuries and all that. So as a result, the world has adopted this calendar system. Usually these days, though, instead of BC and AD, you will see the terms BCE and CE, which stand for Before Common Era and Common Era. That newer naming convention was adopted because, gee whiz, not everybody in the world is Christian. Also, on top of that, there's a lot of scholarly debate on what year Jesus was actually born, assuming he historically even existed in the first place. Of course, there are other calendars besides the Gregorian calendar. Other cultures have measured dates by solar years and lunar months, or something similar, and they would just mark year 1 according to some other event in their respective history. According to the Islamic calendar, it's the year 1444. According to the Chinese calendar, it's going to be the year 4715 soon. According to the Hebrew calendar, it's the year 5783. Which begs the question, how did Jews go 1,000 years without Chinese food? It's an American joke. Anyway. When the Church of Satan was founded in the year 1966 CE, we declared this to symbolically be the start of the Age of Satan. So that is 1 Anno Satanas that year, 1 Anno Satanas. So 1967 would be year 2 Anno Satanas, 1968 year 3 Anno Satanas, and so on. I see people on occasion who make the mistake of just subtracting the number 1966 from the current year if they want to find the year in Anno Satanas. And mathematically that does not work, because you see 1966 was the year 1 and not year 0. There was no year 0. Same with BC and AD for that matter. So to find the year in Anno Satanas, what you do is subtract 1965 from that year, or a quicker way to do it, if you're dealing with a year in the 21st century, is just to add 35 to the last 2 digits. That's what I do. So 35 plus the 23 in 2023 gives you 58. So this is the year 58. Or for American football fans, just take the Super Bowl number of a given year and add 1. I made a Dr. Shits meme a while back about that. Also, although the Church of Satan was founded on Walpurgisnacht, April 30th, 1966, the year changes with the calendar year. So the year changes on January 1st. Doesn't change on April 30th. So that is just about everything you would ever need to know about the years in Anno Satanas. Let us now get to the listener email. Stephen writes, I have a simple question that I hope you wouldn't mind shedding some light on. I know there is talk of greater magic and lesser magic. I'm the type of person who just enjoys Satanism as a belief that I am my own god, and that my high level of intellect is high enough to allow me to live an outstanding life. If I disregard a few of the items listed in the Satanic Bible, does that somehow make me not fit into the church? He then immediately followed up with a second email clarifying, please do not mistake why I seemingly ask these questions. I am simply a man who tries to understand thoughts that randomly go through my head. Doesn't mean I believe in the question itself. I am always thinking about what I can do to better myself. I always look forward to learning more from the magisters in the church. So I wrote back to Stephen and I said that I talked a little bit about this subject in Satansplain episode number 22. And I also said that when you say the line, disregard a few of the items listed in the Satanic Bible, well, if you mean the physical ritual items, then the short answer is no. Cutting corners on a ritual by leaving out the chalice or substituting some other item does not necessarily invalidate the entire ritual. As I mentioned in that Satansplain episode, even if 2 different Satanists or 2 different groups of Satanists tried following the standard 13-step satanic ritual in the Satanic Bible and tried following it as closely and literally by the book as you possibly could, the 2 rituals would still not look exactly the same. They would look different because there's so much room for customization and personal aesthetics and all that. In fact, the ritual pretty much encourages it. It encourages that kind of customization. Now, this doesn't mean that anything is possible or that there are no wrong ways to do a ritual. There is still some structure to it and some obvious do's and don'ts. You don't do a ritual with one hand holding your phone and checking social media while you hold the sword with the other hand. You don't sacrifice animals in a satanic ritual. We know why from the Satanic Bible. Yep, that doesn't jive. Page 89. You don't do a blessing from the Virgin Mary in the middle of your satanic ritual. So again, some obvious don'ts. You do, however, go to the ritual with some kind of purpose in mind, even if it's just a celebratory or fantastical purpose. Ritualizing for the sake of ritual, I would still say that's a purpose. You do cut out the distractions and potential interruptions and instead sustain a certain state of mind while you're doing this ritual. You do have some way to sense the beginning and end of the ritual and so on. So again, a lot of obvious do's and don'ts. Of course, I may be barking up the wrong tree as I say all of this because I think what Stephen really meant by disregarding a few of the items is disregarding the entire notion of greater magic or lesser magic itself. I don't regret reiterating the points I just made, though, since those sorts of things do come up in a lot of satanic discussion anyway. But let us look at this question of, can you reject the notions of lesser and greater magic, or for that matter, 1 or 2 other concepts found within the pages of the Satanic Bible? Can you do that and still legitimately consider yourself a Satanist? Well, to that, I would have to answer that question with another question, and that is, what exact elements are you disregarding, and what is your reasoning for doing that? So for the sake of the argument, let's first just stick with this notion of lesser and greater magic. I would say that these are not requirements, per se, of Satanism. They are tools, rather, tools which are available to the Satanist. That's how I would see it. And we can even find examples of non-Satanists employing these same tools in other ways, even if they don't call it by the same names, even if they, weren't using the same terminology. I've pointed out before that it's strange how when people interview the Church of Satan, a lot of the time they ask about ritual, almost every interview. And when they want to show photos and videos of people from the Church of Satan, videos and photos of Satanists, it's usually scenes from satanic rituals. But the reality is that this is something we Satanists only spend a small fraction of our time doing. Even Satanists who ritualize very frequently are still doing most of their living as Satanists outside of the ritual chamber, applying the philosophy in day-to-day life. And most religions do have a ritual requirement. For example, you go to this particular 1-hour service every weekend, or if you're new to this religion, then you do this baptism ritual. There's a ritual if you get married, and so on. The Satanic Bible points out that religions do this in part in order to sustain the beliefs their congregants have in the religion, sustain those beliefs. Though the Satanic Bible also takes it a step further and says, well, if humans can use symbolism and ritual and metaphor to sustain belief in these spiritual lies of religions, these supernatural superstitions and irrational dogmas and so on, then humans can use these tools of ritual and symbolism and so on to sustain belief in the truth, belief in carnal truth. Also, we know that not everybody needs ceremony and fantasy and enchantment to the same degree and the same frequency, the same elaborate, formalized level. And this is the main reason why the Church of Satan does not have local buildings you go to for weekly services. Because Satanism doesn't work like that. You ritualize as the need arises. So what do we make of somebody who says that they're a Satanist and they live their life by those 40-something pages from the Book of Lucifer in the Satanic Bible, but say they have no need for formalized ritual and no interest in lesser magic? Well, I am skeptical of this take, and what I told Stephen is, it's one thing to decide, not to have an altar set up at home. Not every Satanist does. It's one thing to say you haven't run into a situation in life yet where you felt a dire need to perform any of those 3 conjurations yet: compassion, lust, or destruction. It's one thing if you say, well, I'm pretty new to Satanism and this magic stuff sounds interesting, but I haven't got around to, trying it out, haven't really gotten around to getting the tools. I'm still kind of thinking what I would want to do and so on. That's fine. But if you say you're a Satanist and you've been living life as a Satanist for some time, and yet you outright dismiss 2/3 of the pages of the Satanic Bible, you dismiss all of the Satanic Witch, you dismiss all of the Satanic rituals, then at the very least, I would say you may want to reevaluate your position. Are you sure, for example, that you're not dismissing all of these things based on misunderstandings of what they are and how they work? Because I see that all the time. Is there a part of you, perhaps in the back of your mind, that is honestly afraid about getting into the ritual chamber and getting into a suspension of disbelief because you're afraid you won't have any control over yourself? Are you the sort of person who can't even suspend disbelief, or for that matter, even in the context of enjoying a fantasy or fictional movie or a book? Are you the sort of person who has to analyze what's wrong in every scene of a movie? Or aside from all that, are you maybe a victim of past religious programming and you're letting that religion you escaped to now define the whole notion of ritual for yourself and, basically ruin it for you? Are you a provocateur who was drawn to Satanism for its rebellious traits, its blasphemy, but you're just incapable of being serious or paying attention to something for 20 minutes? Are you maybe feeling intimidated when you see the list of altar tools and think it's asking for too much or it's too complicated? It's not, by the way. I remember a woman years ago who told me, well, I'm a Satanist, but I'm also a skeptic and an atheist, and well, I would feel silly saying all of these calls and names and stuff with the candles and so on. Okay. Who would you feel silly in front of if it's just you in a room? That's what I don't understand. If you're too self-conscious to get into that frame of mind, especially when so many of us other atheists are able to, then maybe that's a you problem. Maybe you have an insecurity issue you want to examine. Maybe you're throwing all of this away and rationalizing it with, well, none of this is required for Satanism. I was told it was not a requirement, so I don't have to do it. I don't have to read about it ever again. Okay. But again, I would argue that it sounds more like an excuse. There's a lot you're throwing away here. You're throwing away most of what's in the Satanic Bible. You're throwing away satanic rituals, throwing away, for that matter, when we get into lesser magic, the satanic witch. And if you are dedicated to a particular religion enough to call yourself that, but you're throwing most of it away, whether it's Satanism or anything else, I have to say you may want to stop and reconsider. Personally, I am of the mind that every Satanist should try a formal satanic ritual at least once in their lives. Both a solitary ritual and a group ritual, for that matter. Do each of these at least once before you die. Even if you only end up doing each of them once in your life, that leap from 0 to 1 is immensely bigger than the step from 1 to 2 or more. Don't die a satanic ritual virgin, that's what I say. But ritual aside, let's look at the bigger question of, can I be a Satanist if I don't 100% agree with everything Satanism says? Well, I have to ask, what is that part or parts that you disagree with? If you say you believe in 85% of Satanism, okay, what is that other 15% then? Because I've run into people like this. They'll say they've found Satanism, they agree with it enough to consider themselves Satanists, but they disagree with the part about this or the part about that. Now, is the Satanic Bible some sort of text like the Bible or the Quran, where our religion treats it as some infallible, divinely revealed dogma? No, of course not. Can you believe in only 85% or 90% of the Satanic Bible and consider yourself a Satanist? The short answer, I would say, is yes, but again, I think it still begs the question of what that 10% or 15% you rejected. What was that all about, and why? Because in my experience of meeting and talking to various Satanists over the past 25 or so years, I've found that when somebody says this, that, they don't believe it 100%, it turns out that the disagreement, the parts I disagree with, is usually due to one of two things. Either one, it's not an actual disagreement, but a misunderstanding of what Satanism says or what Satanism allows for. Or two, they're missing the boat on a lot of what the rest of Satanism is about, because a lot of it is really connected. So let me explain what I mean. In the first case, for example, I've run into people who said, well, I'm a Satanist for the most part, but I heard Peter H. Gilmore say in an interview that Satanists are atheists, but you see, I'm actually an agnostic. Well, I did an entire episode on Satansplain explaining this idea, explaining the misconceptions between atheism and agnosticism and so on. And in cases like this, the self-declared agnostic is inevitably an atheist who just doesn't have their vocabulary straightened out. So I explained either you believe in a deity or you don't. You are either a theist, a person who believes in a deity, or you are an atheist, a person who does not believe in a deity. If you're not a theist, then you are an atheist. It really is as simple as that. Agnosticism is not some sort of third option or middle position on a scale of certainty. So here's the question. Do you live your life thinking that there is some supernatural deity out there whom you must serve, that plays a role in your life, answers prayers, has a set of demands, will call you out after you die and somehow retain you retain consciousness? So if the answer to all of those questions is no, then what is the conflict you think you're having with Satanism? It sounds like there isn't one, and you're just hung up on semantics. Now, as I also explained in that Satansplain episode, there are some people who say, well, I'm an I-theist, and therefore I'm not an atheist. It's like, okay, but you're still kind of doing a stupid semantics argument. When a Satanist says, I am my own God, obviously I'm not saying that I'm a supernatural deity in that sense. I am still an atheist because I still believe that gods are fictional. They're the invention of the human mind. Now, on the other hand, the other example I mentioned are the people who do seem to understand a particular part of what Satanism says and still reject it. But the rejection doesn't make much sense in light of the other parts of Satanism that they allegedly agree with. So, for example, I ran into somebody years ago on a Satanism forum who rattled off some remark about homosexuality being unnatural or bad. And I pointed out that the Satanic Bible makes it clear that homosexuality is fine in Satanism. And he said something like, oh, yeah, I know that, but that's just, that's like the one thing I disagree with. Yeah, I'm still a Satanist. And I told him I don't understand how you can rationalize that position against the rest of Satanism. Satanism includes, indulgence over abstinence, rejecting the satanic sin of solipsism. You are your own God, and so on. So if a gay Satanist finds indulgence by hooking up with other gay adults with, nothing illegal, nothing irresponsible, nothing non-consensual about it, then, satanically speaking, what's the problem? More importantly, why would you care? Well, gay people kind of creep me out. Okay, then don't hang out with them. Well, I don't like this LGBT political agenda. Okay, there are plenty of LGBT people themselves who don't like the political stuff and the collectivism and all that stuff, and they want nothing to do with gay pride events or that whole scene. So it tells me that your hang-ups have nothing to do with what Satanism says about different sexual orientations. And again, I don't understand how you can single out something like that and somehow keep the rest. So in summary, I would say, if you're somebody who has to ask, can I reject this and that part from Satanism and still be considered a Satanist, then I think you should ask yourself the following questions. One, are you sure that your rejection of whatever part it is not based on a misunderstanding? Are you sure that your personal take on some issue is not allowed in the Church of Satan? But also, for that matter, are you sure it's part of Satanism and not, say, Anton LaVey's personal opinion? Because Anton LaVey wrote a lot of essays where, for example, he denounced, say, stereo recordings and multi-channel. He had a whole rant about that. I disagreed with that, but I'm still a Satanist, obviously. Also, are you sure your acceptance of parts A, B, C, and F of Satanism is consistent with your rejection of parts D and E? So these are all things to think about if you're in that position. One final thing I want to say before the break. You might recall that 4 or 5 or maybe it was 6 episodes back, I responded to an email asking me about Temple of the Vampire and if I may be of interest in having somebody on the show to talk about that. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I reject Temple of the Vampire. I don't want to have anything to do with them. But you see, apparently I was a bit sloppy in the way that I rattled off that email on the air, because the guy who wrote it wrote back to me and he said that the way that I said it, it sounded like as if this listener who wrote in was asking if he could be the representative to come onto the show and talk about it. So after I responded on the air, he then corrected me. He pointed out in this follow-up email that he was not asking if he himself could come and talk on the show, but rather, if you read the email more carefully, Bill, he was suggesting that some actual representative of Temple of the Vampire, somebody else, come on Satansplain. My answer, of course, is still no, but apparently this listener was taken aback by this little mistake of mine, so I'm here to clarify that, yeah, the anonymous person from Temple of the Vampire was not himself a representative. He wasn't trying to be a representative. He wasn't trying to offer himself as a representative. I'm sure this news will set everybody at ease now, and the Temple of the Vampire will not have to take issue and investigate an anonymous member of theirs because of my sloppy misreading of an email, and whose name I never gave in the first place, and is an organization I still don't care about. Well, let's take a break. When we come back, I'll respond to a question I got related to being a Satanist out in the workplace. Stay tuned.
You are listening to Satansplain, real satanic talk with Church of Satan Magister Bill M. For questions, comments, and correspondence, send an email to bill@satansplain.com.
I don't care what you believe, but you got to admit beliefs are odd. You know what I mean? You have to admit that. A lot of Christians wear crosses around their necks. You think when Jesus comes back, he ever wants to see a fucking cross? Kind of like going up to Jackie Onassis with a rifle pendant on, you know? Just thinking of John, Jackie, just thinking of John.
That little bit of comedic blasphemy was brought to you by The Devil's Mischief, comedy that's not made for the masses. Listen to the show The Devil's Mischief on RadioFreeSatan.com.
Magister Bill M. here with Satansplain. Visit the official website of the show, Satansplain.com. There you will find all of the episodes available for listening. You can also listen to Satansplain on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and all that stuff. Check out the links on Satansplain.com. To get updates on the show, you can find the Satansplain page on Facebook, the Satansplain channel on Twitter. Give me a like or a subscribe there, whichever is the case for that platform. You can also email me. bill@satansplain.com is the email address. And that is how I prefer you answer questions, because I don't always see replies to tweets. I don't always see messages, direct messages in Facebook, so email's the best bet. I've got a message here from Omar. Omar wrote to me that he works for a particular well-known company. I'm not going to say the name of it. And he was recently reached out to by the company's DE&I, that's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion personnel. He says, and they want my religious views. I am a Satanist, yet I am not a member of the Church of Satan and seek not to speak on behalf of the Church of Satan. In the event of them asking for a member of the Church of Satan to speak on the organization, who could I reach out to for that? Or do I reach out to you? So the answer is yes, you could reach out to the Church of Satan if you'd like an official media representative who can come and give information like this when somebody needs it in an official capacity. But what I said to him was, I'm confused as to why they're asking this in the first place, or why they'd even ask that question. It is absolutely none of their business that you're a Satanist. It is not your employer's business at all. Whatever religion you practice, it should be irrelevant. The only exception I can think of is maybe in extreme circumstances, it's a job directly and explicitly involving a religion itself. So yeah, I could see a Jewish community center curious to know if you are Jewish, if you were applying to work there, if you're going to work as their cafeteria chef. Maybe at least they'd want a working knowledge of kosher dietary rules or something. But if we're talking about your typical purely secular job, then your religion should be none of their business again. So Omar then wrote back and further explained, well, they already know I'm a Satanist, and a manager in my department simply asked me if I'd speak on my religion, and I thought it would be a great opportunity to shed light onto what Satanism isn't, and with all the false information about Satanism going on, I just thought it would be a good opportunity. That's all. Well, since it's none of their business, I will decline them then. Thank you for the advice. So I wrote back again, and I told them that my own personal answer, if this were me, if my employer somehow found out I was a Satanist and I was asked to go speak out about it, my answer would be, I don't believe that religious or political discussion should be in the workplace. And the reason why is because these are topics that coworkers may often have deep emotional investments in. Thus, it can lead to conflicts that are very divisive and unprofessional. I know that Satanism in particular often sparks a lot of that kind of controversy, and frankly, I just want to be judged by the merit of my own work at this company, not by my religion. So another thing I added was, think about this. Suppose you did go ahead, Omar, and take up the offer to talk about Satanism, or for that matter, have me or some other Church of Satan representative do a presentation to your coworkers about Satanism. Okay. Well, there may be a Christian coworker who sees all this and then says, well, you know, since he got to lecture the company on Satanism, I should get to lecture the office on Jesus. Or maybe another coworker says, hey, I'm a Muslim, and there are misconceptions about Islam, so I should be allowed to go teach the office all about Islam. I mean, if I got a company email at work saying that there was going to be a seminar on Protestantism or Mormonism or Scientology or whatever, first of all, I don't think I would go. They couldn't make me go, I don't think, just as I doubt a company could or would even try to make it mandatory for employees to attend a Satanism lecture. Sounds like there may be a lawsuit, if that was the case. But second of all, I would say, yeah, I got your email about, this thing for Islam. What does any of this have to do with my job here? What does this have to do with the product we make for the company? Well, you see, Jane is a Scientologist, and she feels that there are lots of misconceptions about Scientology, so we're having somebody from the Scientology Institute come into the office and talk about it. Okay, but what if I don't care if Jane is a Scientologist? Or for that matter, a Mormon or Muslim or whatever. I could not care less what religion she believes in or practices in her spare time. This is work. This is not the place for that. So it's the same sort of thing with Satanism. It wouldn't really convince the people who might need convincing. It would just make the workplace more awkward. And for better or worse, you would be judged by your coworkers forever afterwards as being a Satanist. Now, maybe the idea of being the office Satanist has a novelty value to it. You might like that kind of attention, but again, think of the longer term, think of the repercussions of something like that. Now, going back to Omar's original message, he says that this came about by whoever it is from the company's DE&I team, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion team. And these days, companies, particularly large companies, have these sorts of people. And as a Satanist, I have to say that I find such job roles to be complete and utter bullshit. As a Satanist, I am against equity, for starters. Many people have been duped into thinking that equity means the same thing as equality, so that if you're against equity, you're a racist or something. No, that's not what it means. Equity is the forced outcome. It's forcing the outcomes to be equal. And this goes directly against pentagonal revisionism, point number 1, stratification. Satanism, you see, is a religion of meritocracy. This comes about straight from Satanic Statement number 7, I would say. Satan represents man as just another animal. We accept the fact that humans are part of the animal kingdom, and with that comes the acceptance of hierarchy and differences in abilities. As a Satanist, I am not an egalitarian. I do not think that each and every human is of equal stature and worth to each and every other human on the planet. There are some individuals who are clearly inferior to me in almost every conceivable way. There are some individuals who are clearly superior to me in almost every conceivable way. Granted, it's not so fine of a scale that you can take all the billions of people on the planet and line them up in an exact sequence of inferiority to superiority. George Carlin had a joke about this in one of his books. He said that people like to use the phrase that no matter how bad your day is, somebody else out there has it worse than you. And Carlin argued that no, logically, there does have to be one person at the bottom of the list who has it worse than everybody else. But the problem, you see, is that the further and further down you go, the harder and harder it is to distinguish which of two particular people has it worse than the other. And the same in the opposite direction for that matter, of course, when it comes to superiority. But to think that this means everybody is equal, I would say, is just silly. Now, I said that equity is not the same thing as equality. More specifically, equity is not the same thing as equality of opportunity. I most certainly believe in the equality of opportunity. I think somebody, for example, who comes from a poor neighborhood, but is really smart and really wants to learn more, really wants to go to school to become a doctor, should take advantage of scholarships and whatever other leverage there is, because that is stratification. You are allowing the more advanced individual to advance to his or her own level. This is why Satanism, for example, does not jive with race-based ideologies of supremacy, and like actual white supremacy I don't mean white supremacy in the way that it's overused today to mean, oh, somebody disagreed with me politically online. Oh, somebody doesn't vote Democrat. No, I mean actual white supremacy ideology. The notion that by virtue of being of a particular race, you are innately superior to people of another race, that notion doesn't really work with Satanism. I've heard these white supremacists and the like say, well, black people make up 13% of the population, but they cause 50% of the crime, and their average IQ is a full standard of deviation down from that of whites, and the continent of Africa has never produced this, and this, and blah, blah, blah. To which I say, okay, but even if we go along with all those claims of yours, you're still judging people by collectives. You're still judging people by the entire demographic. And as a Satanist, I judge people based on individual merit, because the individual is not the collective. I don't care how some person's racial demographic performs collectively. I don't care what their country of origin has or hasn't accomplished. To me, it's like judging somebody based on what city they're from because you don't like that city's sports team or whatever. I judge by the individual, judge by individual merit. Now, on the other extreme, you have these sorts of DEI people and others, usually on the political far left, who play the same game as the racial supremacists on the far, far right, letting the collective demographic define the individual. They just do it in the opposite direction, where I think it's even more absurd. Oh, black people are marginalized in society, and if the percentage of blacks we have in the company doesn't match the percentage nationwide, then the only explanation for this is systemic racism, and the solution is to try to hire more black people. Or, oh, women make up 51% of the population, so there must be some sexist glass ceiling reason why they only make up a minority of physics majors and engineers and mathematicians. So we need to approve all the female applicants that come our way to be physics majors or apply for this engineering job, regardless of what their GPA or other level of expertise is. It's absurd. And by the way, don't think that this is just an anti-white thing or an anti-male thing, because it's not. Because in recent years, Harvard University and other colleges have found that they get a disproportionately high number of Asian students who graduate, so they have begun turning down more Asian applicants in order to lower the percentage of Asian graduations and get higher percentages of the other races among the student body. Yes, these schools are discriminating based on race in the name of fighting racism. Again, absurd. There have even been college prep instructors, you can read articles on this, giving advice to Asian high school students on how to appear less Asian on their resume, and thus have a better chance of getting into some of these colleges. Again, I'm not making this up. Oh, Bill, well, you said articles. Well, those must have been from some crazy right-wing conservative news outlet. No. The New York Times, for example. Fucking New York Times had an article on this. You can look it up. They'll say, don't check off the box for race, and don't put things like chess club or math club in your resume. You want to appear less Asian, and so on. Also, regarding the whole name, diversity, equity, and inclusion, first of all, I'm hardly the first one to point this out. Well, first of all, I'm not the first one to point out that they order it as DEI and not DIE, because if you had it as diversity, inclusion, and equity, it would spell die. But also, diversity and inclusion essentially mean opposite things. You want more different demographics represented because they're different, but you want inclusivity because you want them to be the same. Okay, it's a contradiction, but never mind that. Why do companies have these useless positions in their companies, director of diversity and so on? Frankly, I think it's to act as some kind of insurance against the mob of politically correct people who go online and smear the company if there aren't signs of DEI stuff. Unfortunately, I think what these companies don't realize is that by having a DEI director or what have you, you're not avoiding that mob, you're letting one of them control your HR department. So bringing all this back to the original message I got from Omar, why would an office's DEI director want to have a Satanist talk about Satanism to the office in the first place? I suppose it's possible they know that there are Christians in the office and they may get some sadistic glee out of triggering them in a passive-aggressive way. But let's assume for the sake of the argument that their intentions instead are for the good. They see Satanists as this marginalized minority, and they want to help uplift we Satanists or show that the Satanist is an example of diversity for the sake of showing diversity. As I've said here on Satansplain before, I do believe we need to speak out against misinformation on Satanism. There's a lot of misinformation on Satanism, and I think we have to speak out against it when it comes up. Not that I'm saying we need to spend every waking moment correcting every misconception out there, because we would never get any sleep in that case, let alone be enjoying our lives as Satanists, which is what we should really be doing. But as Satanists, we are not victims. We are not martyrs. We don't huddle together in collectivism and say that we're a marginalized group. We don't whine and say that we're helplessly oppressed victims. We get together on occasion, but not for that reason. So we are not victims, we are not martyrs, we are adversarial. We are our own gods. And this is what we mean when we say the satanic community is a myth. We are not a community, at least not in the sense of a demographic that is fighting for social acceptance, fighting for social justice for ourselves. No. We are Satanists. Satan, again, the adversary. So I don't want Satanism to be part of some office's DE&I preaching. Furthermore, I don't want some HR woman to exploit me through my religion to make me a diversity poster boy for her own agenda. And all of this, by the way, is completely aside from one of the biggest reasons Satanists have traditionally not let their affiliation be known in the workplace. We've seen Satanists in the past get harassed, or worse, for just being Satanists. I've gotten my share of hate mail and harassment from being a Satanist. And the sad reality is that there have always been holy rollers out there who would do whatever damage they could do to a Satanist career if they could. In fact, we've seen people who maybe weren't all that particularly religious in the first place, but nevertheless bought into the propaganda and lies about satanic ritual abuse, for example. Granted, there are many Satanists who thankfully have careers, allowing them to be more out of the closet as a Satanist, or don't really have much fear of repercussion if that were to get out. I talked about this in one or more of the interviews I gave in 2022, where I was asked about being out of the closet as a Satanist. I know Church of Satan members who are professional musicians in death metal bands. I know Church of Satan members who run tattoo parlors. And yeah, they can afford, those Satanists can afford to be out of the closet as Satanists compared to, say, Church of Satan members who are kindergarten teachers or work in the corporate world or do freelance work where being completely publicly out as a Satanist might work against them. One of the many reasons why counterproductive pride is one of the 9 sins. And sometimes when this topic comes up, I'll hear the counter-argument of, oh, but here in the United States, they can't do that, Bill. They can't fire you for your religion. Now, legally, that may be true, but you can't always rely on the government to protect you in cases like this. A company may know they can't fire you for being a Satanist, but they may instead try to make life hard for you in other ways. A boss might suddenly get strict about when you punch in and punch out, or give you tasks that are impossible to do in a short time, or, dig up something deep in the handbook, some rule that is usually not enforced, and enforce it on you. Or they may say, well, I'm firing you and we don't have to give you a reason because you signed this form when you joined and accepted the job, which says we have the right to terminate employment for anybody for any reason, and so on. So again, my point is that if they really want to can you, they can find loopholes like this. Having said all of that, I will concede that in this day and age, that sort of thing is nowhere nearly as bad as it used to be. In this day and age, you're much more likely to get targeted and fired for holding certain political views rather than certain religious views. Personally, I'm far more concerned about the PC police than the holy rollers when it comes to ideological power somebody may be able to exert on you. But to be cheerfully used as fodder for somebody else's politically correct agenda, to be the poster boy of Satanism and oppressed religions for a corporate office. Just, the notion of that just kind of creeps me out. So that some demented HR woman can come bait and virtue signal just strikes me as, using me. So in closing, what can I say? Adversarialism, meritocracy, and exclusivity doesn't really jive with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Actually, before we end the episode, I have to say that previously on Satansplain, as I mentioned, I did a two-part episode, 2 episodes on logic and fallacies, and I did not include any Satanacdotes in that. I did tell a personal anecdote in part 2, but it wasn't really a satanic anecdote. So let us get back to the satanic anecdotes and finish this episode with this Satanacdote.
Satanic anecdotes. Satanacdotes.
I got this Satanacdote from Paul. Paul says, "Hello, Bill. First, I would like to say how much I am enjoying the Satansplain podcast. I really appreciate the work you have put into it, and at times tuning in and giggling along has really made a change to a rough day. Secondly, I asked my wife permission to tell you this anecdote, after which she informed me that she is also sending you this one as I write this, so it might be a strange coincidence. And finally, here is my anecdote. This story goes back to Walpurgisnacht 2020. My wife and I planned to ritualize together on this night, and ahead of the date, we both booked time off work to ensure that we could have a late night of ritual and indulgence. After us both doing some planning during the week prior, the evening was going to, as we hoped. My wife performed her ritual with my assistance, followed by a short intermission for a glass of our favorite rum, and then my own ritual was to follow. During our intermission, we headed to the kitchen together, treating it as a separate space from the ritual chamber. This is where we hit a flaw in our plan for the evening. I had totally forgotten that the window blind in our kitchen had been removed that week. As I'm sure you're aware, be it from visiting or movies, many houses here in the UK, where I live, are in very close proximity to each other. We entered the kitchen in ritualistic robes, myself wearing a hooded cloak and suit. My wife, however, was wearing a hooded cloak and lingerie. Immediately, we saw our neighbor's teenage boy looking directly at us from his bedroom window. In a panic, we dropped to the floor, hiding behind our kitchen counter, unaware of how much he saw. We still indulged in our favorite drink. However, we did this while crawling around the kitchen floor in full garb, avoiding the teenager across the street seeing us. The entire incident added many laughs to the evening, and we are still not 100% sure how much our neighbor's son saw, but nobody has said a word about the incident since. Well, thank you for that Satanacdote, Paul. And with that, I will say goodbye. See you next time on Satansplain. Hail Satan.
You have been listening to Satansplain. For more information about the show, visit the official website at Satansplain.com. And for more information about Satanism itself, visit churchofsatan.com. This episode, copyright 2023, Magister Bill M.